Listen to that. No, that's not the scream of a Stuka dive bomber. And it's definitely not the terrifying squeak of a Tiger tank's tracks that we talked about in the last video. That is the sound of Detroit. That is the heartbeat of the archers of democracy. In our last episode, we looked at the Germans, with their invincible Tigers and their over-engineered super complex machines. They treated war like it was an art gallery. Every tank had to be a masterpiece, handcrafted by artisans, even if it broke down 5 miles later. But the Americans? Oh man, their philosophy was totally different. For the United States, war wasn't art. War was a business. And in business, you don't care about making a perfect product that takes 6 months to build. You care about efficiency, logistics, and volume. You care about crushing the competition with sheer numbers. General Eisenhower, the guy who basically ran the whole show in Europe, said something really interesting after the war. He listed the machines that actually won the conflict, and he didn't name a heavy tank. He didn't name a giant artillery piece. He named the C-47 Dakota airplane, the landing craft, and the Jeep. Yeah, a tiny four-wheeled car with no doors. While the Germans were obsessing over making the perfect transmission for a 70-ton monster, the Americans were figuring out how to ship Coca-Cola, fresh socks, and reliable tanks to the front lines by the millions. Today, we are going to crack open the arsenal of democracy. We're going to look at the Sherman and finally answer the question: was it really a death trap? Or was it actually the unsung hero of the war? We'll look at the Hellcat, a tank destroyer that was basically a hot rod with a cannon. And we'll see how an endless river of trucks, the Red Ball Express, strangled the Nazi war machine. This is the story of every American vehicle used in World War II, and how they won the war, not by being the best, but by being the most. Buckle up. Well, actually, the Jeeps didn't have seatbelts, so just hang on tight. You are watching The War Arsenal. If you want to unlock history's deadliest inventory and see the real stories behind the steel, make sure to smash that subscribe button right now. Let's ride. Chapter 1, The Rough Start. Okay, let's be real for a second. When the war kicked off in Europe in 1939, the United States was not a military superpower. I mean, their army was smaller than Portugal's, and their tank designs? They were basically jokes. Look at this thing, the M2 light tank. It looks like someone glued 2 machine gun turrets onto a farm tractor and called it a day. It has 2 turrets. Why? I honestly don't know. Maybe so the commander and gunner could ignore each other. By the time the US actually entered the war after Pearl Harbor, this thing was totally obsolete, a Stone Age relic. But it served one purpose. It was the classroom. American tankers learned the ABCs of armored warfare in these weird little boxes. But then, things got serious. Enter the M3 Stuart. The British were actually the first ones to use these in combat, receiving them through Lend-Lease in North Africa. And they loved them. They gave it a nickname, Honey. Why? Because unlike the British cruiser tanks that broke down if you looked at them wrong, the American Stuart, worked. You turned the key, and it started. It had a 37mm gun, which was basically a pea shooter against big German panzers, but it was fast. I'm talking 36 miles per hour, 58 kph fast. In the desert, they would literally drive circles around the slower German tanks. It was the float like a butterfly, sting like a bee strategy. The only problem: it was cramped. I mean, if you were claustrophobic, this was not the tank for you. The fuel tank was right next to the crew, So if you got hit, well, let's just say you didn't want to be inside. But the US realized they needed a bigger gun. They needed a 75mm gun to fight German armor. But they didn't have a turret ready that could hold one. So they panicked and built, look at it. It looks like a condo complex on tracks. It was a stopgap design, a temporary fix. The main 75mm gun was stuck in the hull on the right side. It couldn't rotate. You had to turn the entire tank to aim. Then it had another 37mm gun on top and a machine gun cupola on top of that. It was so tall that German anti-tank crews could see it from like 3 towns over. Hey Hans, the Americans are coming, put the coffee on. We sent a bunch of these to the Russians too. You know what the Soviet crews called it? A grave for 7 brothers. Yeah, Russian humor is dark, but accurate. It was flawed, it was ugly, but it had a big gun, and it held the line until the real hero arrived. Chapter 2. The Icon, the Sherman myth, and then the star of the show arrived. The Icon, the M4 Sherman. Now listen. If you go on internet forums or play War Thunder or World of Tanks, you always hear the same trash talk. The Sherman was garbage. It was a death trap. They called it the Ronson lighter because it lights up first time every time. Listen to me closely. That is a myth. Well, mostly. According to the experts at the Tank Museum, the Sherman was one of the best tanks of the war. Not because it was the strongest, but because it was the smartest. Let's look at the numbers. Detroit was spitting these things out like candy. 50,000 of them. Can you imagine that number? If a German Tiger tank broke a transmission, it sat there for weeks waiting for a specialized mechanic and a crane. If a Sherman broke down, you just pushed it into a ditch and grabbed a brand new one from the depot. It was the ultimate disposable weapon. And about that burning reputation. Yeah, the early models had dry ammo storage, and if they got hit, kaboom. But the Americans fixed it. They introduced something called wet stowage. They surrounded the ammo racks with jackets of water and glycerine. If an enemy shell hit the ammo, the liquid would flood the bin and put out the fire. After that upgrade, the Sherman statistically became one of the safest tanks to be in. It burned less often than the German tanks. But, you know, bad reputations stick. As the war dragged on, the Sherman evolved to hunt the big cats. When the armor wasn't enough, they made the M4A3E2 Jumbo. It had extra thick armor plating welded on. It could literally bounce Tiger shells from the front. When the gun wasn't enough, the British took the Sherman and shoved their massive 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the turret, creating the Sherman Firefly. It was the only Sherman that could kill a Tiger from long range. The Germans were actually terrified of the Firefly. They would target it first because they knew it could hurt them. And finally, the EZ-8, M4A3E8, wider tracks, smoother suspension, and a high-velocity 76mm gun. This is the tank Brad Pitt commands in the movie Fury. It was the peak of the Sherman line. But right at the end of the war, the US finally said, okay, let's build a heavy tank. Enter the M26 Pershing. This thing was a beast. It had a 90mm gun and armor that could stand up to the Tiger. But it arrived too late. Only a handful saw combat in the famous Zebra mission. There's a famous video of a Pershing destroying a Panther in Cologne near the cathedral. It proved that if the war had gone on longer, American armor would have dominated on quality and quantity. Let's take a breather. I want to put you in the commander's seat and you have a choice. Option A, you're in a Tiger. You are invincible, theoretically. But your engine is making a weird knocking noise. You're almost out of gas, you have no air support, and if you break down, nobody is coming to save you because your recovery vehicle was bombed yesterday. Option B. You're in one of 5 Shermans. Your armor is thin. If you get hit, it's gonna hurt. But the inside is roomy and ergonomic. You have 4 other tanks covering your flanks. You have P-47 Thunderbolts flying overhead. You have plenty of gas, unlimited ammo, and a hot meal waiting for you at the camp. Does a super weapon win a war? Or does teamwork and logistics win? Let me know in the comments. Personally, I think I'd take the Sherman. I like having friends with guns. Chapter 3. Tank Destroyers. Speed Kills. Now, the US Army had this weird doctrine early in the war. The general said tanks send to fight other tanks. Tanks are for supporting infantry. If you see a German tank, you call the tank destroyers.
Was it a good idea?
Not really. Because German tanks didn't exactly wait for you to make a phone call. But this flawed doctrine gave us some incredible machines. First, the M10 Wolverine. It was built on a Sherman chassis, but with an open-top turret. Open-top. That means if a grenade lands in your lap, or an artillery shell bursts overhead, game over. But it was cheap, it had a good 3-inch gun, and they made thousands of them. Then came, oh man, this thing, the M18 Hellcat. Look at the name, Hellcat. This wasn't a tank, it was a hot rod with tracks. It used a radial aircraft engine and weighed almost nothing. It could hit 55 miles per hour over 80-kilometer range. It was the fastest tracked vehicle of the war. A Tiger's turret rotated so slowly that a Hellcat could literally drive laps around it before the German gunner could get a bead on it. The armor? Paper thin. Like 12 millimeters. A heavy machine gun could punch through it. But the philosophy was, if you don't get hit, you don't need armor. Speed is armor. Hit and run. Shoot and scoot. Hellcat crews were like cowboys running wild on the battlefield. But eventually, the Germans rolled out the heavy stuff. The King Tigers and Panthers with thick frontal armor. Hellcat's gun just bounced off them. So the Americans brought out the big brother, the M36 Jackson. It looked like an M10, but it carried a massive 90mm gun. This was the equalizer. It was the only American vehicle that could look a King Tiger in the eye and punch a hole right through its front armor from a distance. When the infantry saw M36s rolling up, they cheered. They knew the big cats were about to get declawed. Chapter 4. Logistics. The real heroes. But friends, let's be honest. The war wasn't won by guns. It was won by gasoline, bullets, and spam. The real heroes were the logistics vehicles. The stuff that gets zero glory in video games but does 90% of the work. The Dodge WC series. The soldiers called it the Beep, Big Jeep. It was a 3-4-ton beast. Ambulance, radio truck, weapons carrier. It did everything. It was the mule that carried the Army's backpack. And the legendary GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a Half. A 2.5-ton truck. Have you heard of the Red Ball Express? After D-Day, General Patton's tanks were moving so fast towards Germany that they outran their supply lines. The railroads were bombed out. The pipelines weren't ready. Patton was running on fumes, so they created a conveyor belt of trucks. The Red Ball Express. Thousands of these GMC trucks, driven mostly by African-American soldiers, ran 24 hours a day, non-stop. They drove at night with headlights off, exhausted, dodging snipers, hauling millions of gallons of gas to the front. If those trucks stopped, Patton's army would have stalled, and the war would have lasted another year. That is logistical victory. And finally, the legend, the face of the American military, the Willys Jeep. What can I even say? 4 wheels, a steering wheel, zero comfort, 100%. It was a marvel of standardization. Ford and Willys both built them, and the parts were interchangeable. It was used as a chaplain's altar, a general's limo, an ambulance, a machine gun platform. The Germans were obsessed with it. I'm serious. If they captured a Jeep, they would fight each other to drive it. Why? Because their own cars, the Kübelwagen, were only 2-wheel drive and got stuck in the mud. The Jeep was 4x4 and never stopped. It was a little green giant. Chapter 5, Special and Weird Tech, Pacific and Beyond. The Americans also got a little experimental, especially in the Pacific Theater against Japan. You had the LVT Alligator, a swimming tank. Its tracks worked like paddles in the water, and then it could crawl up the beach onto the coral reefs. Without this, the Marines could never have taken the Pacific Islands. And the Dookie W, or the Duck. It's a truck that thinks it's a boat. It could grab supplies from a ship in the ocean, swim to the beach, drive onto the road, and deliver them to a depot inland. No cranes, no docks, no waiting. Just pure logistical magic. We also saw the M24 Chaffee light tank, replacing the old Stuarts. It was sleek, fast, and packed a 75mm punch, a true modern light tank. But my personal favorite oddity, the T-34 Calliope. Imagine a Sherman tank. Now strap 60 rocket tubes to the top of the turret. It was a psychological terror weapon. The Germans had the Nebelwerfer screaming rockets. Well, the US said, cool, we have rockets too, but ours are mounted on a tank. It could unleash a thunderstorm of high explosives in seconds, and then drive away before the smoke cleared. Lastly, the M8 Greyhound, a 6-wheeled armored car. It was fast, quiet, and had a decent gun. It was the eyes and ears of the army. These guys would sneak so far behind enemy lines that sometimes they'd accidentally drive into German headquarters and have to speed away before anyone noticed. At the end of the day, were American vehicles perfect? No. A German Panther was a better piece of engineering than a Sherman. A Tiger was scarier. But war isn't about having the best toy. It's about having a toy that works and having 10 more ready to go when that one breaks. America won the war on the assembly lines of Detroit. While the Germans were hand-polishing every bolt to make a masterpiece, the Americans were stamping out war machines by the thousands. Standardization, logistics, and raw industrial power. As the saying goes, quantity has a quality all its own. And that was the winning formula. The British eccentrics. Okay, so we've seen German engineering failures. We've seen American industrial brute force. Now, it's time to get weird. Like really weird. The British. They went to war with a stiff upper lip. But their tanks? Some of them laid carpets on the beach. Some of them flailed chains to explode mines. And yes, I am not joking. Their tanks came equipped with a tea-making machine. The boiling vessel. If you want to see the fine line between genius and total madness, click this video right here to see the British funnies and the toys of His Majesty's Army. I've got the kettle boiling. See you there.